Imagine waking up one morning to find your country no longer sovereign, not because of war or invasion, but because of contracts, interest rates, and payment schedules. No tanks, no troops, just debt. Over the past century, nations didn't lose their freedom in battlefields. They signed it away in boardrooms. Quietly, incrementally, modern finance replaced political power with economic dependence. Central banks, once national servants, became global enforcers. Debt wasn't a crisis, it was a system. An empire without borders, ruled not by emperors, but by interest payments. This is the story of how freedom was redefined, how the chains of conquest were replaced by spreadsheets, and why most countries today are colonies in everything but name. After the final artillery barrage of World War I faded into silence, the great empires of Europe stood not in triumph, but in quiet collapse. But the ruins of battlefield supremacy gave way to something more enduring, a financial order that would redraw the map of global power without a single shot fired. Across Europe, treasuries were empty, currencies were broken, and the cost of war had outlived the will to fight. Germany, saddled with impossible reparations through the Treaty of Versailles, became the first major casualty of this new regime, not through invasion, but through compound interest. American banks flooded the Weimar Republic with loans under the Dawes and Young plans, temporarily propping up the German economy while converting it into a debtor colony. Britain and France, although victors in name, found themselves equally entangled, borrowing heavily from the United States during the war, and now trapped by repayment schedules they couldn't meet without squeezing their colonies. The pound sterling and French franc became instruments of desperation, backed less by gold than by colonial taxation and asset liquidations. Meanwhile, in London and New York, financiers emerged as the true victors. Institutions like J.P. Morgan and Co. and the Bank of England maneuvered behind closed doors, restructuring sovereign debt in a way that subtly rewrote the very meaning of independence. In Latin America and Eastern Europe, nations seeking reconstruction aid quickly discovered the new rules: budget discipline in exchange for liquidity, foreign oversight in exchange for solvency. What began as emergency lending rapidly ossified into systemic leverage. National treasuries were no longer the final word in economic policy. That authority migrated to international bondholders, often anonymous but deeply coordinated. The League of Nations itself, established as the guardian of post-war peace, housed a financial committee dominated by central bankers and private creditors, whose prescriptions for stability required debtor nations to adopt austerity long before the term became common. This silent coup did not unfold with the spectacle of imperial flags raised over palaces. It happened in vaults, in conference rooms, in memos written in technical jargon. The language of conquest was replaced with terms like liquidity assistance, debt sustainability, and conditional restructuring. Military occupation became unnecessary because economic conditionality achieved the same outcome. By the 1920s, the old symbols of imperial dominance, ceremonial crowns, colonial viceroys, naval squadrons, were increasingly irrelevant. Real power flowed through balance sheets, creditor committees, and interbank lending networks. The sovereign was no longer a monarch or a president, it was the yield curve. Behind every act of national legislation loomed the question of credit ratings and loan maturities. This was not a retreat from empire, it was its reinvention. The age of soldiers had ended, the age of accountants had begun, and the world, still reeling from the last great war, scarcely noticed that a new empire was forming, not one of land, but of leverage. The Treaty of Versailles marked the official end of World War I, but it also marked the beginning of something far more enduring, a system of economic bondage disguised as post-war justice. Germany, declared the sole perpetrator of the war, was handed a reparations bill so vast it could not be paid in currency, gold, or even time. It was to be paid through submission. The initial 132 billion gold marks, roughly $442 billion in today's terms, were not merely punitive, they were mathematically impossible, designed not to be fulfilled, but to justify endless oversight. Unable to meet these demands, the Weimar Republic turned to American financiers who offered lifelines in the form of massive loans under the Dawes Plan of 1924 and later the Young Plan of 1929. But these weren't acts of rescue, they were acts of entrapment. The borrowed money flowed back to Britain and France, who used it to repay their own war debts to the United States, creating a circular system in which Germany borrowed to pay reparations. The Allies received those payments to service their own loans, and the U.S. banks reaped interest at every point in the loop. What emerged was not recovery, but a perpetual cycle of dependency, a closed financial circuit in which sovereignty was an illusion, and payment schedules governed state behavior more effectively than any occupying army. The Reichsbank became an American client in all but name, its monetary policies constrained by foreign terms, its inflationary collapse in 1923, a symptom of pressures no domestic government could contain. When the Young Plan attempted to extend and restructure payments in 1929, it effectively locked in generations of financial servitude by disguising burden as generosity. Germany's industrial base, instead of fueling domestic prosperity, became a collateral engine for international lenders as its profits were earmarked for debt service, not reconstruction. The model didn't stop at Germany. Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey all found themselves subjected to similar arrangements, loans contingent on accepting League of Nations financial advisors with de facto veto power over state budgets. Across the continent, debt was repackaged as diplomacy, and economic occupation wore the mask of international aid. The Versailles framework had birthed a new order, one where victory no longer required territorial conquest, only contractual dominance. The real power lay not in battlefield trophies, but in signatures beneath columns of interest rates and maturity dates. Sovereignty was no longer measured by national anthem or flag. It was measured by how much control a nation had over its own fiscal calendar. Versailles did not rebuild Europe. It converted it into a network of debtors, each chained to the next by flows of borrowed money that could never be fully repaid. Empires no longer needed to expand, because now, holding the right paper was enough to rule the world. As the dust settled from the First Great War and nations turned to reconstruction, the machinery of monetary sovereignty began to shift. Central banks, once instruments of national policy, started morphing into nodes of a transnational architecture that answered to no parliament, no electorate, and no constitution. This transformation was quiet, deliberate, and methodically orchestrated through institutions like the Bank for International Settlements, founded in 1930. Ostensibly created to manage German reparation payments, the BIS quickly became a sanctuary for central bankers to meet beyond the reach of public oversight. Month after month, representatives from the Bank of England, the Reichsbank, the Federal Reserve, and others gathered in Basel, not to defend national interests, but to harmonize strategies under the veil of technical necessity. The language of their discussions was insulated, cloaked in the jargon of liquidity ratios, gold flows, and discount windows, but the effect was profound. Monetary decisions with sweeping national consequences were increasingly shaped by consensus among unelected technocrats. As these relationships deepened, central banks began to behave less like arms of sovereign governments and more like members of an exclusive cartel, protecting each other from market panic, depositor runs, and political interference. By the mid-1930s, policies like interest rate coordination and gold reserve management were no longer unilateral decisions. They were orchestrated responses agreed upon behind closed doors. This emerging global network operated in shadows, invisible to the democratic process, yet superior to it in effect. Even in moments of public crisis, such as the collapse of the gold standard in Britain in 1931, or the deflationary spiral of the Great Depression, the responses were crafted not by elected officials, but by central bankers working through the BIS and other informal channels. The illusion of national control persisted. Flags still flew over central bank buildings, and annual reports still claimed independence. But the real power lay in Basel, where a small circle of insiders could make decisions that rippled through millions of lives, from farmers in France to factory workers in Detroit. Sovereignty was preserved cosmetically, but gutted in practice. Governments could pass budgets, but only within the limits set by interest rates they didn't control. They could promise full employment, but their central banks could raise rates to stabilize inflation, overriding those goals. The paradox was complete. Central banks were independent from their governments, but deeply dependent on each other. This interdependence served as a protective shield against democratic reform, insulating monetary policy from populist demands, national crises, or even electoral upheavals. As the world hurtled toward another global conflict, this supranational banking alliance had already taken root. It did not fly banners or hold territory. It required no loyalty oath or military base. Its dominion was secured through clearing systems, reserve quotas, and overnight lending agreements. The illusion of independence was maintained with great ceremony, but behind it, the world's monetary future was being written in meetings no citizen would ever attend. In July 1944, as soldiers bled across Europe and the Pacific, another kind of war was quietly being decided in the mountains of New Hampshire. At the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered not to end a war, but to design the world that would follow it, a world built on finance, not force. On paper, the Bretton Woods Conference promised cooperation and stability, but beneath the language of progress and partnership lay a blueprint for a new kind of empire, one centered around the U.S. dollar. The institutions born from this summit, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, were presented as guardians of global prosperity. In reality, they were enforcement arms for a monetary regime that placed the United States at its apex. The IMF would police currency values and lend dollars under strict conditionalities, effectively disciplining national policies according to external standards. The World Bank, meanwhile, would steer development financing in ways that embedded countries deeper into the dollar-based system. The agreement locked all participating currencies into fixed exchange rates against the U.S. dollar, which in turn was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. Only America could convert its currency to gold. Every other nation had to hold dollars as reserves. This arrangement created a structural dependence that appeared cooperative, but was inherently asymmetrical. As long as global trade and aid flowed through dollars, every central bank in the world had to serve not just its own country, but the monetary needs of the United States. Britain, once a dominant financial power, was reduced to supplicant status, forced to accept humiliating terms in post-war loans and dollar access. France, devastated and desperate, had little choice but to accept a system in which it would never hold veto power. Smaller nations, many just emerging from colonial rule, were offered seats at the table, but none near the head. The language of Bretton Woods was technical: peg rates, gold convertibility, reserve quotas, but its consequences were deeply political. Monetary sovereignty became conditional. A country that faced balance of payments issues would not be offered solidarity, it would be offered credit with strings. To access funding, governments had to submit economic plans for IMF approval, often requiring austerity, currency devaluation, or liberalization, policies that served creditors first. The illusion of multilateralism masked a hard truth. Bretton Woods created not a partnership of equals, but a financial hierarchy, with Washington at the top and every other capital arranged below. By controlling the dollar, the U.S. controlled the system. The very architecture of global finance, who received aid, how trade was settled, what counted as solvency, was redesigned to pivot around a single currency and the institutions that upheld it. Bretton Woods didn't just rebuild the world economy, it shackled it. And the world's nations, war-weary and in ruins, signed their names willingly to a system that would dictate their futures for generations to come, all from the comfort of a resort far from the front lines. Jacques Rueff was no prophet draped in mysticism. He was a mathematician, a former advisor to Charles de Gaulle, and one of the few minds in 1944 who grasped that Bretton Woods had planted the seeds of its own destruction. While the rest of the world toasted the supposed birth of a new monetary order, Rueff saw a fatal equation hiding in plain sight. If the dollar was to become the global reserve currency, the United States would be forced to export dollars in massive quantities, which meant running constant trade and fiscal deficits. This was not a temporary adjustment. It was a structural requirement. Other countries would accumulate dollar reserves, but those reserves represented a claim on U.S. gold. As Rueff pointed out, this made America a bank, promising to redeem more gold than it possessed. The longer the system persisted, the more mathematically inevitable the default became. Rueff laid out this conclusion with precision, publishing warnings that the dollar standard would collapse under its own arithmetic. But in the post-war euphoria and American economic dominance, his critiques were dismissed as academic eccentricity. Treasury officials laughed him off as a gold bug clinging to outdated ideas, while the rest of the world moved on. Yet as the 1950s progressed, his predictions began to take form. America's gold reserves, which peaked above 20,000 tons, began to decline steadily, even as its overseas military spending, foreign aid, and consumer imports surged. Every exported dollar added pressure to the system. Every deficit increased the global supply of claims on U.S. gold. By the early 1960s, the imbalance had grown severe. The dollar supply held by foreign central banks was beginning to outpace America's ability to honor convertibility. Rueff's predictions weren't just theoretical anymore. They were visible in balance sheets, in central bank gold outflows, and in growing nervousness among America's allies. France, under de Gaulle, began publicly echoing Rueff's warnings. In a 1965 televised address, de Gaulle declared the system an exorbitant privilege for the United States and began converting French dollar reserves into gold. The move shocked Washington and confirmed that Rueff's arguments had gone from fringe theory to geopolitical action. Still, American officials refused to admit the core flaw. They blamed speculators, foreign jealousy, even outdated economic thinking. Meanwhile, the gold pool created by Western central banks to suppress the metal's market price began hemorrhaging reserves. Rueff, undeterred, continued issuing precise calculations showing that the day would come when the U.S. could no longer honor convertibility at $35 an ounce. By the end of the 1960s, his predictions became undeniable. The numbers had caught up with the promise. Foreign central banks held more than twice the gold claims that America had left in its vaults. But even then, Rueff was not vindicated by those in power. Instead, his accuracy was buried beneath diplomatic silence and policy obfuscation. Yet in private, central bankers began to speak of closing the gold window, an acknowledgement that Rueff had been right all along. What they once mocked, they now feared. The system had to collapse. The only question was when. On August 15, 1971, in a quiet televised address, President Richard Nixon delivered a statement that would end an era and inaugurate a new one, though few watching at home realized the gravity of what had just occurred. Announcing the temporary suspension of dollar convertibility into gold, Nixon severed the final thread connecting global money to physical value. But this was no mere monetary adjustment. It was the quiet execution of a world order built on trust, replaced overnight by a system built on control. From that moment, the dollar ceased to be a claim on gold and became a claim on nothing but itself, a fiat instrument upheld not by reserves, but by geopolitical leverage and military might. Nixon framed the move as a defense against foreign speculators, but the real threat wasn't external. It was the arithmetic Ruth had predicted decades earlier. The U.S. owed more gold than it could ever deliver, and the world was lining up to collect. France had already extracted thousands of tons. Others were preparing to follow. Nixon's declaration slammed the vault shut. The global gold standard was dead, and with it, the last restraint on currency creation, debt issuance, and financial expansion. But what followed was more than monetary chaos. It was the institutionalization of global dependence. Every nation holding dollars in reserve now held unredeemable promises. Their savings were no longer anchored to metal, but to a paper system backed by nothing but the implicit threat of being locked out if they dared challenge it. Sovereignty, once a matter of law and flag, became a matter of access. Opting out of the dollar meant losing access to oil markets, trade settlements, and financial liquidity. Central banks that had once debated gold parity were now forced to hoard U.S. treasuries to stabilize their own currencies. The Federal Reserve became the de facto central bank of the world, setting interest rates that dictated economic conditions in countries from Brazil to Bangladesh. The IMF, once a rules-based body, pivoted to enforcing compliance with a floating rate world centered on dollar stability. Nations that wavered were punished, not by soldiers, but by capital flight, currency collapse, and frozen credit lines. In effect, the end of convertibility marked the rise of a new form of empire, one that didn't occupy territory but controlled the monetary oxygen flowing through every global system. The dollar's strength no longer came from its convertibility, but from its necessity. Trade, debt, energy, all priced in dollars, all dependent on continued obedience to the architecture Washington now fully controlled. There was no vote, no treaty, no referendum, just a televised speech and the quiet reordering of global power. The rules had changed. The cage door had closed, and every nation that had signed up at Bretton Woods, hoping for stability, now found themselves trapped in a monetary regime that could expand infinitely, demand allegiance silently, and crush dissent economically. The world hadn't just lost a currency anchor, it had lost the last meaningful barrier to financial domination. Sovereignty died, not with a bang, but with a signature. In the wake of Nixon's gold shock, the U.S. faced a dangerous question. How do you maintain global demand for a dollar no longer backed by anything tangible? The answer came not in boardrooms, but in desert negotiations that would quietly reroute the bloodline of global finance through oil. In 1974, a deal was struck between the United States and Saudi Arabia that would redefine the modern era. In exchange for American military protection, intelligence cooperation, and arms sales, the Saudis agreed to price all their oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars. This wasn't just a trade agreement, it was a geopolitical engineering feat. By linking the world's most essential commodity to the dollar, the U.S. ensured perpetual demand for its currency, regardless of domestic economic conditions. The petrodollar was born. It meant that any country needing oil, every country, had to first acquire dollars, which meant holding dollar reserves, transacting through U.S. financial institutions, and ultimately lending power to America's fiscal deficits. Even adversaries couldn't escape it. France, Germany, Japan, and China all had to play by the rules. Sovereignty was no longer about borders or flags. It was about whether a nation could access the energy it needed without bending to the dollar's orbit, and very few could. Saudi Arabia, flush with cash from its newfound leverage, began recycling its dollar surpluses back into U.S. financial markets, purchasing treasuries, funding deficits, and stabilizing the very currency it was sworn to support. It was a loop of enforced dependence. America protected the House of Saud, the Saudis kept the oil flowing in dollars, and the world had no choice but to comply. The deeper this system embedded itself, the harder it became to challenge. When Iraq under Saddam Hussein attempted to sell oil in euros, sanctions followed. When Libya floated the idea of a gold-backed dinar, bombs fell. When Iran sought to bypass SWIFT, it faced global economic isolation. These weren't coincidences, they were enforcement mechanisms. The petrodollar wasn't just about pricing, it was about obedience. If a nation threatened the system, it threatened not just U.S. economic interests, but the foundation of its global power. Washington didn't need to invade every defector, markets and militaries aligned to do the job. The cost of energy became the cost of compliance, and for those who refused, the penalties were swift and severe. Meanwhile, domestic fiscal discipline became irrelevant. The U.S. could print money, run deficits, and still have the world's central banks absorb its debt. The more oil was consumed, the more dollars were needed. The more dollars were needed, the more treasuries were bought. The more treasuries were bought, the more America could spend without consequence. What looked like economic brilliance was, in truth, a carefully constructed trap, one that held the entire planet hostage to a currency with no anchor but trust, no value but inertia, and no alternative without risk. Energy had been weaponized, and the chains wrapped tighter with every barrel pumped and every dollar printed. As the petrodollar system tightened its grip on global finance, the next phase of control moved from oil to policy, enforced not with weapons, but with spreadsheets and loan agreements. By the 1980s, waves of financial crises across Latin America, Africa, and Asia drove desperate nations to the doors of the International Monetary Fund. But the help offered came at a price far greater than interest. The IMF, designed under the architecture of Bretton Woods, had morphed from a currency stabilizer into a financial sovereign overseer, issuing conditionality-laden loans that rewrote national priorities from the outside in. Countries like Mexico, Argentina, Ghana, and Indonesia were told that assistance would only come if they adopted a structural adjustment programs, packages crafted not by their own economists, but by unelected technocrats in Washington and Basel. These programs mandated the same brutal formula: slash public spending, privatize state industries, liberalize trade, devalue the national currency, and remove price controls. In theory, these steps would restore growth and attract foreign capital. In practice, they gutted public services, drove up unemployment, crushed domestic industries, and made nations more dependent than ever on foreign creditors. Education budgets were halved, healthcare systems collapsed, subsidies for food and fuel disappeared, triggering riots and political upheaval. In Zambia, government resistance to IMF demands resulted in suspended loans and rising child mortality. In Jamaica, debt repayments eclipsed health and education spending combined, locking generations into economic stagnation. The message was clear: compliance with IMF doctrine was not optional. Resistance would not bring tanks, it would bring liquidity freezes. Credit lines would vanish overnight. Currency values would plummet. Bond markets would punish dissent like heresy. Even food imports could be choked off by dollar shortages. In this new form of warfare, deprivation replaced invasion. The IMF's stated goal was stability, but the actual result was control. Nations were told how to price their currencies, how to manage their budgets, which industries to sell, and to whom. Local elections became increasingly meaningless when a foreign institution could override government policy by simply threatening to withhold the next tranche of funds. Democracies were hollowed out from the top down, their parliaments debating laws they didn't truly author. The very concept of self-determination eroded, replaced by the cold logic of debt servicing. The IMF didn't need to occupy countries to rule them. It only needed a signed agreement and a balance sheet in red. This was not foreign aid. It was a monetized form of obedience. And once a country entered the program, escape was nearly impossible. Payments stretched across decades, often compounding as new loans were required to repay old ones. The cycle ensured dependency, ensuring that policy remained aligned with creditor expectations, not citizen needs. Sovereignty was no longer undermined with coups or invasions. It was dissolved through memorandum of understanding, translated into policy papers, and enforced through the silent weapon of liquidity control. Nations weren't just borrowing money, they were mortgaging their future autonomy. As global finance moved from paper ledgers to cloud networks, the architecture of control transformed into something nearly invisible, yet infinitely more powerful. The old mechanisms of monetary dominance, gold redemption, conditional loans, even petrodollar diplomacy, now converged into a digital infrastructure that made sovereignty not just negotiable, but programmable. Systems like SWIFT, once seen as neutral communication tools for international banking, revealed their true nature as global choke points. A country could be disconnected with the flick of a switch, as Iran discovered in 2012 and again in 2022. It didn't matter if a nation produced oil, food, or manufactured goods. Without access to SWIFT, it couldn't transact globally. The punishment was exile from the financial bloodstream. Trade froze. Imports stopped. Inflation soared. But SWIFT was only the beginning. As central banks began experimenting with digital currencies, CBDCs, the final layer of programmable control emerged. Unlike physical cash, which enables private transactions, CBDCs allow governments to trace, restrict, or reverse any payment in real time. This isn't theoretical. In China, the digital yuan already includes expiration dates and spending restrictions. In the West, pilot programs tie digital wallets to identity verification, carbon tracking, and even health data. What's emerging isn't just a currency, it's a behavioral enforcement grid. With CBDCs, stimulus can be made conditional, benefits can be revoked instantly, purchases can be flagged or denied based on arbitrary criteria. Capital controls no longer require legislation. They require a few lines of code. Even private banks have become enforcers in this new model. Automated sanctions, driven by AI compliance systems, now freeze accounts based on vague suspicion algorithms rather than court orders. Entire families have found themselves locked out of savings because of travel to sanctioned regions or donations to flagged organizations. There is no appeal, no trial, just the quiet click of an unauthorized transaction message. Financial censorship, once the domain of authoritarian regimes, has become global best practice. Payment processors can blacklist dissenting voices. Crowdfunding platforms can shut down causes deemed politically inconvenient. Surveillance isn't a byproduct of modern finance. It is its foundation. Every transaction is a data point. Every wallet is a node in a network of control. National governments, eager for efficiency and stability, have signed away autonomy to this system, often without understanding the full implications. Once digitized, finance stops being a tool of policy and becomes a policy in itself. And as the infrastructure goes digital, so too does control. Armies are no longer needed to blockade a country. Capital flow permissions and API keys now define borders. A nation can be silenced not by bombs, but by a denied transaction. The world of monetary power has become frictionless, borderless, and relentless. Control is now invisible, encoded into the protocols of global finance. In the age of digital leashes, sovereignty isn't just fragile, it's obsolete. By 2025, the illusion of national independence had worn thin, stripped bare by the relentless arithmetic of debt service. Across continents, finance ministries released budgets that read like ledgers of obligation, where interest payments consume more than education, healthcare, or infrastructure combined. In Ghana, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, and Argentina, the math told the same story. The price of past bailouts, bonds, and deficit spending was now national policy, dictated by necessity, not vision. Nations still held elections, but their outcomes were boxed in by creditors whose only ballot was a risk assessment. The new colonial order had no flag, no anthem, and no military, but its reach was absolute. Credit rating agencies like Moody's, S&P, and Fitch became high priests of this empire, their downgrades triggering currency crashes, capital flight, and political crises within hours. Governments scrambled to appease them, slashing pensions, raising taxes, gutting social programs, all to earn a higher grade. This was not governance, it was hostage negotiation. The empire of debt had redefined the terms of sovereignty. No longer defined by law or constitution, sovereignty now existed only within the bandwidth permitted by bond markets and dollar liquidity. The World Bank, once the lender of hope, now operated as an enforcer of restructuring discipline. Its reports, couched in the language of development, carried the weight of imperial decree. The IMF, more sophisticated in its language, continued its strategy of issuing recommendations that no debtor nation could afford to ignore. Even former colonial powers found themselves in submission. Italy, once the center of European civilization, spent more on interest payments than on defense, innovation, or child welfare. Japan's debt to GDP ratio had passed 250%, yet it remained afloat only because its own central bank bought its bonds, a closed loop of artificial solvency. The United States, though still the issuer of the global reserve, carried a $35 trillion debt burden that forced it to rely on continuous bond issuance and foreign purchases to avoid collapse. It was an empire living on borrowed time, literally. Beneath it all, the new masters didn't wear medals or carry weapons. They wore suits, signed contracts, and sat on global finance boards. They held no territory, yet governed nations through capital flow and compliance clauses. Private equity firms and sovereign wealth funds acquired ports, power grids, farmland, and telecom infrastructure, effectively turning core national assets into profit centers for offshore investors. Ownership had been transferred not through war, but through insolvency. The result was a world that looked post-colonial on maps, but remained deeply colonial in structure. Formerly independent states now functioned as administrative zones for creditors, their populations managed through policy parameters defined abroad. The currency of conquest had changed from bullets to basis points, from battleships to balance sheets. The empire of debt didn't need to conquer. It simply waited for nations to sign the dotted line, and once they did, every decision, every budget, every law became subject to the same silent master, the math of interest.